With them in future years, produce symposiums, publishing legal scholarship, and bringing people in the international law and the global justice field to Virginia Beach for events like this and hopefully other events and events on Regent's campus as well. The Journal of Global Justice and Public Policy was formed just this year. It was the result of a merger from two prior journals on campus, one being public policy, the other one covering international law. The focus on the journal this year, going forward, is to focus more on the global justice field, human trafficking, the rule of law, and the impact in public policy decisions that affect that area as well. We publish different legal scholarship articles, we publish student written materials, we'll be publishing these symposium panels as well, so we'll get them transcribed and they'll be available for print. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen the previous journals available for pickup over in the auditorium or the lobby over in the other Robertson Hall. Our first issue will be coming to print soon. It's been a bear trying to get a brand new journal off the ground, I'll tell you that, but we thank you guys for coming out. We have our keynote speaker who will also be speaking tonight at the banquet in a little more detail. Let me pull out my notes here as I introduce him. His name is Benjamin Nolot. He is the president and founder of Exodus Cry, and he's the producer, writer, and director of the Nefarious documentary trilogy. Exodus Cry is an international anti-trafficking organization committed to abolishing modern-day slavery and assisting the victims of human trafficking through rescue, rehabilitation, and reintegration into society. Benjamin devotes his time to the abolition work for the ending of slavery and exploitation of the vulnerable, and his greatest passion in life is to love God and see his creation set free from the tyranny of slavery. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Nolot up to give his presentation.
Good. Thank you. It's such an honor to be with you guys and to speak concerning this very important topic. I want to thank Cortland for inspiring the idea that made this all happen and for bringing me out here and just the whole leadership here of the law program at Regent. I've been given 15 minutes, which is, for me, it's going to be a miracle if I do get that done. So just be praying for me as I jump in. I want to talk a little bit about the sexualization of culture, the subject that we're discussing for today, this weekend. For me, it starts with the issue of the power of story. And so when we're thinking about the sexualization of culture and the impact of that, as we're talking about human trafficking and like for me, being on this journey, one of the questions that has been stirring in me for these past few years has been, what kind of society is producing so many men that are willing to buy these women and children for sex? And so when we begin to examine these weighty issues of justice and exploitation in our culture today, I think we have to talk first about the power of story. And I want to spend a lot of time on that. But just to say that I think that it's important to understand the role that story plays in developing the values and the ideas of a culture. And so in previous generations, you might have a town pastor or a village sage or a teacher or some type of leader in the community that would be the predominant storyteller for that particular culture and for that particular community. And in that regard, you could kind of craft, your vision, your values, your ideals about life through these means. You could control that to a degree. And there was, oral traditions that would be passed down and so on and so forth. But what we have seen change in our generation is the usurping of the role of storytellers on the part of media. And so this is a dynamic and interesting transition that has occurred during this media age that we live in. And what I refer to this as is as the great social experiment. We are the first generation in history to grow up as a part of this kind of grand social experiment, to grow up as a part of a generation that has become saturated with media. And we don't fully know the implications of that yet. We're starting to see the warning signs and the alarm bells going off. We don't fully know. We haven't completely taken an inventory for what is the impact of that. But the storytellers of today have transitioned from these places of parents or teachers or pastors or so on and so forth to the corporate media industries. So you have the advertising industry, you have the music industry, you have the film industry, you have the porn industry. And these are financially motivated industries that have taken the role of the place of storyteller in our culture today. Now, when we think about stories and the stories that are being told, again, I just want to emphasize that how significant, how strategic it is, the stories that are told in the development of the ideas of a culture. Plato, in thinking of his utopian city, his ideal for this utopian city, actually banned storytellers from that city because he understood the power of story to disrupt this kind of utopian narrative that he was creating. So when we think about the power of story in shaping culture, in shaping our values, and we think about the role of media that has come in to usurp that place of storyteller in our culture, we have to begin to ask, well, what is the story then that media is telling? And what socializing impact does that have on us? What impact does the story that media is telling us have on the development of my ideas and values as a man, and the construction of my masculine identity? And what impact do these stories have on the development of women and their identity and their values and the construction of their ideas of femininity? I won't have time to fully go into both of those things, so I'm just going to examine the issue of the sexualization of women in our culture today. But these issues, the other thing I would throw into there is what story is being told in our culture about sex and human sexuality. These are really, really critical issues for us to discuss in the age that we live in. Gender and sexuality. The two things that we really, in the church traditionally don't like to talk a lot about. I've actually never sat in a church and heard a message on human sexuality my entire life. Not once. And this is like, the one thing the Bible goes, if this one thing gets off track, it causes havoc. I mean, there's so much in the Bible about this one area, and yet we don't talk about it. Well, our culture is being brought to a point today where I think we can no longer not talk about it. We have to address these issues of gender and sexuality because they are at the root system of so many of the injustices that we are seeing proliferated in our world today and perpetrated in our world today, particularly with the area of human sex trafficking. But I want to talk about the sexualization of women in our culture for the remainder of our time that I have to speak with you today. In my quest to kind of unearth the culture's narrative concerning women, I traveled to Seattle to interview the owner of a bikini barista stand. This place was started in 2003 by a lady named Lori Bowden, and it's called Cowgirls Espresso. And basically what she did is she found a niche in the marketplace up there where she realized that by dressing girls up in bikinis that she could sell a lot more coffee. And so she began to develop a theme for each day of the week. So it was Fantasy Friday and Schoolgirl Thursday and so on and so forth, and all these different themes. And basically the idea was that these girls were dressed in scantily clad clothes selling coffee. So it became a huge success. So within just a few short years between her and other competitors that began to emerge, there are now over 100 of these bikini barista stands in the greater Seattle area. This is the birthplace of Starbucks, and they are actually putting Starbucks locations out of business because so many people are flocking to these bikini barista stands where it's girls, and then they're not just wearing bikinis. It gets, it's sprung out into prostitution and all kinds of things. So I was kind of, I don't know if fascinated is the right word, but just blown away by this trend up in Seattle. 100 of these places. I mean, it was literally, you could drive up the street and it was one after the other, after the other, after the other. And so I began to look out at the culture at large and see so many of these sexually oriented businesses that were emerging. Places like topless cleaning services, places like lingerie barbershops, places like restaurants like Hooters, sexually oriented businesses that has become a major, major industry within the United States. And so what we began to see is this commodification of women's sexuality, this corporatization of women's sexuality. Well, to understand kind of where this all began, you really have to go back to the early 1950s and the launch of Playboy magazine. Now, in 1953, in December of 1953, when Hugh Hefner launched Playboy magazine, he didn't put an issue number or a date on the front cover of that first magazine because he had no idea if the magazine would be a success. So it was just this idea that he was going to get this one magazine out, and of course, we all know the story now that Playboy became a huge success. I mean, an overnight success. Within a few weeks, 53,000 copies were sold. They completely sold out. By 1959, they had a circulation of 1 million. Okay? And here's what he demonstrated through that. Hugh Hefner demonstrated the profitability of exploiting women's sexuality in the marketplace. Soon, other financially motivated business and media entrepreneurs began to join in on what I refer to as the new gold rush. Objectified and hypersexualized female bodies. So the music industry joined in. The film industry joined in. The advertising industry joined in. And pretty soon what happened is that the dominant images of women coming, into the culture were these objectified, hypersexualized images of women. So many of the images that we see today, when we think about sexualization and culture, and we think about, why is it that there are just so many of these, I can't go to like my health food store without there being a scantily clad woman on a magazine at eye level for my 6-year-old son. And we go, where did that come from? Who's making this stuff up? It started back at the time of Hugh Hefner demonstrating the profitability of objectifying and hypersexualizing female bodies. Now, the other thing that happened around this time is during the 1960s, during the time of the sexual revolution, there was kind of an ideological emphasis on women's empowerment and women's liberation. And theoretically speaking, this is a extremely significant and important concept. But what quickly began to happen is that because of the images that were flooding into the culture, the women's empowerment movement got hijacked by objectification and sexualization. And pretty soon, empowerment became synonymous with being sexy, right? If you want to be visible, then be sexual was kind of the implicit message that was happening during that time. Ironically, those who served to benefit most from this new ideal of women's empowerment were in fact not women, but rather men like Hugh Hefner, men in positions to cash in on the currency of female sexuality. The culture began to serve as a kind of recruiting mechanism for him to build his harem and find his centerfolds. And today, Playboy magazine has become an icon of achievement for women. I was talking with Playmate Jessica Hall, who's explained to me that the choice to pose nude for Playboy was easy because Playboy is legendary. Now, this message of women's empowerment by means of sexual objectification is rampant throughout the culture today. So not just something that started back then, but this is what has come into, we have felt the shockwaves of that all the way up to today. So when a woman like Miriam Weeks, a college student, right, goes into the porn industry under the name of Belle Knox, it's under the guise of empowerment, right? Or when a woman like Miley Cyrus is featured swinging nude on a wrecking ball in a music video, it's under the guise of empowerment. That's the language that you'll hear in the interviews with these women about their endeavors into this industry. When a woman like Jennifer Lopez does a music video with an exclusive feature on her behind, it is under the guise of empowerment. They're all saying the same thing. These highly visible women all promoting the same message, that sexual objectification equates to empowerment. And this message is force-fed into the minds of young girls growing up in the culture today. The way to be an empowered woman is to exploit your sexuality and to self-objectify. The language of empowerment has become used almost like a sanitation cream to validate all things raunch within our culture. So therefore, you can have Beyonce doing this hyper-pornified performance at the VMAs, and then end it with this blazing neon sign announcing that she's, that this is all about feminism, the sign feminist. But in this context, Beyonce is just borrowing the term feminist to give the notion of empowerment through sexual objectification some sense of credibility. But this isn't feminism. This is a world made up in the pornographic imagination of the corporate media pimps of our day, a world in which Beyonce and others like her are merely props generating revenue for the sexual circus. Part of what reinforces the message of women's empowerment through sexual objectification is the singularity of this narrative. There really are no other stories that are being told in any kind of prominent way about women in the culture today. So take, for example, Cosmopolitan magazine. Cosmopolitan magazine is the #1 women's magazine on the planet and of all time. Okay? And so what you might expect to find on the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine are women who are models of achievement in various fields, right? You would expect to find some maybe in athletics, maybe some in business, maybe some in different fields, right? But that is not what you're going to see. If you looked at the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine, what you are going to see is the same type of image month after month after month after month after month after month, year after year after year. Like, I was really excited when Kelly Clark won the gold medal for the U.S. in snowboarding in 2002 Olympics. It was kind of a big dramatic thing, and it was a really spectacular event, the snowboarding halfpipe. And you think, well, maybe Kelly Clark, maybe she'll be celebrated as a woman, of achievement in our culture. Maybe she'll get a spot on the cover from college. Not a chance. Not a chance, because she doesn't fit the narrowly defined version of hotness that is defined in our culture today. Who you will find on the cover over and over and over again is people like Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian. And it's nothing against them, but it's this singular narrative. It's the same thing in music videos where it's the single script for women, women presented as these kind of hypersexualized objects in almost universal consistency throughout music videos. It's a world where this kind of pornographic imagination has been created, in which all women are like these, savage nymphomaniacs just looking for any male figure to writhe and cavort their bodies around. Gyrating, twerking, all that, being nude on wrecking balls as Miley Cyrus was. These are not anomalies of the culture. They are emblematic of the culture. If you were to take, say, 100 girls, young girls, 11 to 14 years old, girls coming up into their early adolescence, and you were to ask them, can you identify 3 pop culture icons of today? And undoubtedly, if you were to ask these 100 girls, all of them could give you answers like Beyonce, Rihanna, Britney Spears, Miley Cyrus, so on and so forth, right? I mean, all 100 could give you for sure 3 of the pop culture icons. But if you were to ask those same 100 girls, and again, the point that I'm trying to convey to you is this, is the singularity of this message that is being so promoted within the culture today. If you were to ask these same 100 girls to name the 3 female Supreme Court justices, how many of them do you think could actually do that? I mean, to acknowledge, right, this massive achievement on the part of women in our culture today. How many of those 100 girls, 11 to 14 years old, do you think would be able to do that? I bet you would be lucky to find one who could actually do that. Now, in this room, it's a little bit different, so you guys are kind of exempt from that. But I'm just talking about the culture at large, because I felt a number of you going, I could do that. But our culture exalts the dehumanized, pseudo-empowered sex bot, but does almost nothing to celebrate women's achievements in other areas like athletics, business, academics, or politics. Most often, women excelling in these areas are seen as a threat to the patriarchal system of male domination. We are much more comfortable with women who align with the narrowly defined version of femininity as hypersexuality than we are with women who attempt to break the mold by actually using their brains. The last point that I want to touch on is actually just 2 more quick points. One on socialization, and then one on the cultural feeder system. How am I doing on time, by the way? A couple more minutes? All right. I'm trying to move this along so fast. All right, thanks for your prayers. On this issue of the concept I call socialization, female mind control programming, extensive research has been done to show that girls lose self-esteem, become insecure, and are particularly vulnerable to the messages of the culture during early adolescence. And it's during these early years that they begin to look out at the dominant images in the culture around them to construct their identity. Their ideas of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a successful woman, an empowered woman. And as the girls look out at the culture, they learn very quickly that their value is knit to their sex appeal. The culture pounds them with this message that the most important thing about them is their sexuality. I remember one year when Abercrombie & Fitch came out with a clothing line for the school semester, fall school semester, with a t-shirt that had emblazoned on the front, "Who needs brains when you have these?" I remember watching the Academy Awards a couple years ago when Seth MacFarlane got up on stage and sang a whole song about boobs. And he was singing and dancing, and the whole entire song was just about this one thing. And I'm not trying to be graphic, but I mean, that was what the whole entire song was about. On another occasion, I decided to check out the television show The Walking Dead based on a friend's recommendation. In the second scene of the first show, the two lead male characters are talking about women, but instead of referring to them as women, they refer to them as pairs of boobs. Now, here's the point that I'm trying to make out of this. When the most popular clothing company in our country makes a t-shirt like that, when the most celebrated awards show in the world features a song like that, when the most popular show on television has a dialogue written in like that, the message is clear. Women and girls are not three-dimensional beings with personalities and histories and experiences and preferences and a breadth of interests, right? Of who they are in the world. They are merely a collection of body parts. And the message to young women is your value is measured by your sexuality. Now, as girls begin to internalize these messages, they begin to see themselves through the lens of the male gaze. That is, they see themselves in the way that they are being perceived by men. And so they begin to ponder questions, right? Questions are going through their mind. Now, of course, I'm obviously not a girl, but I have two sisters and I have a lot of colleagues that are women, and these are the things that they tell me, that they have to think in this way of, is my stomach flat enough? Are my legs long enough? And on the questions go. They begin to take on an identity that is not of their own creation, but of a narrow script that has been written for them through the culture. In this way, the culture serves as a form of female mind control programming, shaping women into the mold of a hypersexualized object that exists for male pleasure. Consider some of the phrases of the title articles in Cosmopolitan magazine. 50 ways to seduce a man. Make him hot for you. Make him want you. His secret sex spots. 75 sex moves men crave. The sex truths we learned from 2,000 men. His number one sex fantasy. Make his 4 sex wishes come true. His secret sex spots. On and on and on the articles go. Women exist for male pleasure. One of the most troubling aspects of media socialization in this hypersexualized context is that it grooms women into becoming complicit against themselves through participation in conforming to the culture's narrative, the culture's hypersexualized standard of feminine identity, not realizing the destructive patterns of human thinking and behavior that they're actually supporting in themselves and in the world. Oftentimes, the most vocal proponents of the values of women's empowerment through sexual objectification are in fact women. Meanwhile, the corporate media pimps who set this narrative into motion sit back and rake in the millions. Last point, and just bringing it home here, and I'll make this one quickly, is on the cultural feeder system that we have created for the sex industry, tying this back into the prominence of the sex industry, which has exploded in the past 20 years in our world. And again, I don't have time to qualify all of that and prove all of that. It's not the time for that, but just to say the sex industry has exploded in the world in the past 20 years. The widespread presentation of women as pseudo-empowered, hypersexualized objects in a media age within a capitalistic culture has resulted in a surge of women cascading into the sex industry. Our culture has become a production factory, mass-producing these women for male consumption, while glamorizing the objectification and commodification of female sexuality and anesthetizing the actual harm of a life in the sex industry. Girls are predisposed towards this end. In the pop culture imaginary world of the sex industry, it's all about strip clubs and dollar bills, as Rihanna sings in a hit song, Pour It Up. I spoke with one trafficking survivor who was trafficked at 14 years old. She was lured into a relationship that she believed this man was the man of her dreams. She finds out on the night that they, go off together that he is actually a trafficker. On that same night, along with other traffickers, they dress her up in scantily clad clothes, tell her what she is expected of her or what will happen if she doesn't, and placed out onto the streets of Atlantic City at 14 years old. And I asked her this question: how did it feel to be placed out on the streets of Atlantic City as a 14-year-old girl in that kind of outfit for sale? And she said, to my shock, she said, I felt empowered. And I was stunned by that. And I said, what do you mean, empowered? And this is what she said. I'll just read a direct quote from her. She said, I was groomed by my culture long before I was ever groomed by my trafficker. As a 14-year-old girl, I felt my value was based on how desired I was by guys around me. If I was desired, then I had value. So being on the street in Atlantic City, and all these guys wanted to have sex with me, they wanted to pay me, I thought that was a good thing. I thought it was empowering, and I thought I had value. Our culture has engineered a system of female mind control programming, female brainwashing that is driving countless women and girls into the sex industry with dreams of empowerment and prosperity, only to wind up exploited, traumatized, and broke. The last thing that I want to say about women, I just can't leave this message without saying this, so I apologize in advance for going over on this. I have to just say this one thing. Besides the obvious failure of creativity in the presentation of women in mass media, the story that is being told about women is simply not true. Certainly, femininity includes a much broader and more prolific spectrum than just being hot and being sexual. Women are intellectual, emotional, spiritual, and religious. They are creative, athletic, familial, political, caring, compassionate, relational, and strong. They may desire autonomy and independence, or family and children. They long for commitment and fidelity. They're searching for deeper meaning and purpose. They have history, memories, and unique experiences. They long to have an impact on the world. Simply put, women are not simply a sexual buffet for the gratuitous appetites of men. They're the image bearers of God, and they are the crown of his creation. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King stood on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and he said this: I have a dream that one day my 4 children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And today we have an African-American president in the United States. In many ways, we have overcome the systemic pervasive racism that plagued this country. Beloved, I believe that it is time for us to dream again, because I have a dream that my little daughter will one day live in a nation where she will not be judged by the color of her hair or the measurements of her figure, but by the content of her character. As I said, in many ways, we have overcome racism and we can overcome sexism. Let's create a world where men are loving and respectful and women are valued and safe.
Thanks, Benji. I couldn't help but think, will the church let Islam be the answer to the problem that you posed? Thank you very much. This concludes our proceedings here. Please, we want to send the flowers out with you all, so grab a flower if there's one available. And we reconvene at 2 o'clock in the moot courtroom. Thank you very much.